I'd like to talk about the death industry. The most fascinating subject of all is the end of life. We spend every waking moment avoiding the idea that we're going to die someday. And then, of course, life comes up to us and confronts us with our own mortality, our ending. When people around us die, or whenever a job ends, or a relationship ends, or an outcome doesn't pan out in the way we would have liked. Death is an everyday occurrence, as I've said elsewhere. It is the most ordinary thing. Yet, naturally, it terrifies the crap out of us. Perhaps well it should. But it's a fascination. The death industry, as I've called it, is there are those people that work around death, whether they work in funeral parlours, whether they work in morgues and mortuaries, whether they work in hospitals. There are people that encounter death every day. Even today I saw a job as a bereavement support, paying minimum wage, to work 9 to 5, to be there and to befriend grieving family members. It's the most difficult of human experiences, without a doubt. My mother died as a child, friends have died along the way, people I've met have died, people I've known briefly in other parts of my life, in other seasons of my life. I've heard later on, as we do, that they'd passed away or that some terrible accident had happened to them. I myself took a really close look at death in 2012 when I was run over in an experience that I don't remember, when a car hit me on the pavement. I remember 5 minutes before that, and I remember waking up in intensive care a week later, but I don't remember the event, the individual who hit me with their car as they went into a diabetic coma, and I don't remember any of the treatment. I remember the 5 years of trauma that I knew at the beginning I didn't really want to go through. But in the end, the only way out is through. But part of that, as I've said elsewhere, is spending time considering the nature of my own mortality. I'd just turned 50 at the time I'd been run over. It was a really good time. It was all a gift in the end, because everything is a gift, even though some of those gifts, without making light of them, are really difficult things to go through. I knew it was a gift. It was just one I didn't want. I kept trying to give it back at the beginning of it. I just wanted to put the dark night of the soul that went with that confrontation with that I would die one day, and that I nearly had. I just wanted to put it on a shelf. I think I even said to my lovely wife, I just want to put this in a box and leave it there and not have to feel what I needed to feel, say what I needed to say, and go through the healing of the body in the way that the body needed to heal, because it was pretty mush up. Death and dying is like that. There's the wonderful work of religious people, spiritual people, psychological people, therapeutic people and clinical people. Over the years, the highest philosophical subject is to explore the nature of death and dying. There's a wonderful work of Elizabeth Kubler-ross, who posited the 5 stages of grief. And there are other models of grief now as we've developed more in our understanding of that. The Kubler-ross model is still good. I can't remember the stages off the top of my head, but I do know them. If I looked at them briefly, I'd be able to tell you. I know the first one is shock. They are, perhaps, I'll give it a go, they are perhaps not in the right order. Shock, denial, bargaining, anger, grief, acceptance. That's 6. So that's my best attempt to remember the 5 stages of grief. I came up with 6. There you go, there's a new model. That's the selfless model of grief. And they're really interesting to explore, and in exploring them myself and looking at them earlier in my training and the work that was done to me, it was interesting to see how those were everyday occurrences as well. One I always use, an example I always use, is turning up for the bus, and I start to check my watch, and the bus is late. Or perhaps it's one of those times when you turn up for a bus and the bus doesn't even come at all. It's been cancelled. You've no way of knowing as a bus passenger, would-be bus passenger. And the stages of grief would appear in shock. So there's the initial shock that the bus isn't coming. And then there's the bargaining. I'm like, maybe it's cancelled, or maybe I could walk to the next bus stop. Maybe I could keep waiting. Should I wait until the next bus comes? It's this mental narrative that's trying to reconfigure its way out of the shock. And then there's the anger, of course, with the goddamn bus company. And I've got bus drivers, and there's the frustration about that. These are all necessary and right. And then we're moving towards acceptance, but we're not quite there yet. There's the concern for and the disappointment of that maybe I won't get there, or maybe I'll never get to the appointment or the place that I was going to, or to the town centre or whatever, wherever it was I thought I was going. And I start to feel sad about that. And in more extreme cases, one would then cry, wouldn't one? If someone had died, you'd move into a place where you felt really low and depressed and weep. But out of that pain and difficulty and sadness and frustration begins to emerge in its own way acceptance and the capacity to embody the experience. I would say, and as you've heard, I've had a close look at death and have known dying to some extent, as much as a living person can, and of course only living people can discuss death. We all have a narrative. We each have a narrative around death. There's the phenomenon of near-death experiences. I mean, I was in a coma for a week. I experienced nothing. There was no Will there. There was no Billy there to experience anything. There was just, well, not even anything. If I would articulate what I experienced afterwards, I would say there was just blackness, and there was no person experiencing it. Literally remember 5 minutes before I got run over, but I don't remember the 5 minutes up until when I got run over. Both the suppression of trauma and good clinical ketamine took those 5 minutes away. And then I opened my eyes, and it was 6 days later, and my body had been sewn back together. So I couldn't call that a near-death experience, but we might say that the body was near-ending. If it was left at the side of the road, it would have ended, because there was a burst artery, a spinal injury, head injury, leg injury, and all kinds of lacerations and wounds. It wasn't looking good. Point being, I can't say that I know near-death experiences. There are myriad people describing them, looking down on themselves in operating theatres, or having out-of-body experiences, and there's clearly a nuance between out-of-body experience and near-death experience. And often that narrative that people express are like, this is what I saw when I met God, or this is what God told me to come back to tell you. And of course the critique of that is that this is the nature of the mind, that the mind, just as it is in the dream state, is active enough to give us the personality and experience of something, that it returns to conscious awakenedness out of that state with a story to tell, and I think that could be quite a good critique. I feel like, without having had a near-death experience, or knowing anything about it, but knowing an experience in which my body nearly came to an end, that it's a good approximation to say that this is what the mind does. I like that. That makes more sense to me. And of course, if you look at these near-death experiences described online, if you look at the comments section on those, there's hundreds, probably hundreds, if not thousands of people saying, yes, that sounds like death to me. Yes, this is similar to my near-death experience. And there's a lot of comments about how this is to know heaven, this is to know death, this is to know dying, this is the other side, this is something that we bring back. It's all very spiritual, if you like. Now, without wanting to dismiss those, because again, I've got no experience, so I can only speak of my experience, and I can't speak of other people's experiences, and I won't talk about experiences that I haven't had. That's not fair, and it's not wise, and just not cool. Opinions are like armpits, everyone has a couple, but I'll spare you mine. They're of no interest or use to anybody. But I feel it makes sense to say that this is the nature of the mind, that it gives us opportunities to process that experience of being unconscious or being in another state. Undoubtedly, there are other realms that we all know: a mental plane. We all know the plane of the body with which we experience life. The mental plane is often the dominant plane that we all live out of from birth to death. Human beings do like to live from the top part of the body, or so it seems. The mental narrative that appears in awareness, and we miss the nature of our very being because we're so cathected to, addicted to, attached to the mental narrative. How am I doing? Where am I going? What's this feeling? Don't like this, like that. The way in which we think our way through our world, especially the way in which we champion reason as a species, the way in which we've turned emotional and body-centric therapy into cognitive therapy. All of this is good. It's good to be critical of the things we've learned and experienced ourselves. We can only critique, in the end, our own understanding and our own experiences. So, what I'd like to say about this death industry is that the death industry is an industry for the living. Near-death experience is a phrase only known by living people. It's an idea about what might be, that it's probably healthy to not be so sure of what we know, because no one's ever come back from being dead to tell us what death was like. Living people might reappear in their body, or their body might heal sufficiently that they can talk about what they experienced when the body was near to death. But none of us really know what death is. Even our religious and spiritual traditions that often promote an afterlife, and not all of them do, and some of them champion a better experience of that than this. How would we know? How could we know? We can say, we suggest that it might be a bit like this. Some ideas about afterlife and the nature of consciousness, these are compelling, but they are speculation at best. It's the best we can come up with, is to speculate about what might be. There's every evidence that there's nothing. I know that sounds like bad news. That might sound like bad news to you. The best evidence I've seen is that consciousness continues after the dissipation of the body and the mind. But none of us will be there. There won't be a spiritual ego inside consciousness, absolute consciousness, that's able to go, oh, you know what, everyone really is here, and here's my dog from the 70s, or here's some people from 1,000 years ago in absolute consciousness, and I'm letting you guys know about it. None of that's ever happened. It might sound like bad news. I feel it's good news. I feel it's good to capture an idea of heaven, to capture an idea of life here and now, and to capture ideas about death. Once we come to terms with the nature of life and we begin to learn how to do life well, we can begin to consider these questions, which is why I do and why I want to, as I get older, to embrace death and to be okay with death. And after, to use Ram Dass's quote once again, after spending much of our life trying to become somebody while still alive, spend some time considering all of the suggestions about death, near death, whatever you need, to readily be prepared to become nobody. How beautiful, how just beautiful.